Chapter 11 of the course is about data assembly. Chapter 6 was also about data assembly, and we call this chapter Advanced Data Assembly for the obvious reasons. We're going to look at some techniques and some improvements on techniques relative to what we saw previously in Chapter 6. Speaking of the book, I have uploaded a new copy of the book to the course page on the course website. So you are welcome to download that. In fact, you will need to download that in order to attempt the exercises at the end of the chapter. On Friday this week, we will finish up any remaining topics that we're not able to cover today, and we'll also take a look at the exercises. Please try as many of the exercises as you can based on what you see in lecture today and what you are able to deduce from reading the chapter material. We'll proceed then directly with topic number 1 from chapter 11, and that is called Irregular Extraction. Just by way of background, in chapter 6 we had some character vectors of fixed width, and we have extracted parts of them using the substring function. Substring, as you recall, is an R function that lets you pull out exact positions from within a character string, like take characters 2 through 5 or 1 through 7 or something like that. That technique doesn't work very well anymore if in fact your characters are of irregular length, and I've shown an example of that right up here, and I will actually source this line of code just to make it active in our session. Maybe I'll give myself some more room over here. We don't need to see the files right now or the history. Or the workspace. And that gives us a vector of IDs, which looks something like that. The length issue is more obvious if you convert that to a data frame. Excuse me. Which I've done on the fly here. You see that, for example, these protocol identifiers vary in length, and so do the ID portions of these identifiers. The subject-specific material, they vary in length as well. So, overall, you might even say that this is a fixed width ID, but clearly if you wanted to extract the protocols for numbers for these IDs, that information would not be fixed width. Fortunately, we have this hyphen that occurs in every one of these values, and the hyphen isolates the components of interest. And we'll use that to our advantage with the R base function string split. Now it's actually written str_split. I call it string split. Close enough. You get the idea. What we're going to do is split this ID vector on the hyphen. We could look at the arguments for this function. And we see that the second argument is actually called split. I haven't named it here, but I've passed in a hyphen as the split criterion. Excuse me. So what R is going to do is take each of these strings, find the hyphen, remove it, and give back the pieces that fall to either side of the hyphen. If there had been more than one hyphen in this string, you'd get a rather complicated result. Here we're going to get 2 fragments for each original element of the character vector. So we'll source this line of code and then look at the result. And you see what we get back is not a vector anymore, but we get back a list of vectors. And the main indices of this list correspond to the original elements of our source data. And the elements of the vectors they identify correspond to the fragments, the fragments that result when you split on the hyphen. So far, so good. Now, our goal here was to extract, for instance, just the protocol identifier from this information, and that still gives us a little bit of work to do, because truly this kind of nested list is an unwieldy sort of thing. It'd be very hard to paste this back into a data frame if you were developing some analysis data set. But we can do like you've seen before. We can use sapply to iteratively apply some function over all the elements of this list, and if sapply gets a result of length 1 for each element, it will recreate a nice clean vector at the end of the process. So this code right here, just the protocol here portion, is an sapply call. Let's work our way through it just briefly. The argument is splits. So we're going to apply some function across this list. Now the function we're applying is the subset operator. Actually, we could also have chosen the element select operator. In this particular case, we would get the same result. Not that those two functions do the same thing, but they are analogous in some situations. So whether it's the subset or element select, the point is that this square bracket, if you put it in backticks, is actually the name of a function. So here we've named this function. We don't even have to worry about giving the closing brackets. But this function does require an additional piece of information. That is, if you're going to subset, or if you're going to select an element, you need to identify which element you want. In our case, we want the first element. So we'll pass that as additional information to sapply, and if we've done our work correctly, the result is fairly intuitive. Now we have just the protocol portion extracted from that ID vector. An elegant result. You can use the same idea with modifications in many situations where you need to extract just part of a vector as something informative for your data set. If you have a question about that, feel free to ask me on the fly, and I'll return to it if I see it pop up as soon as I get a convenient point. If not, we're going to move ahead with topic number 2, namely stratified imputation. Now a little background. In chapter 6, we talked about imputation as a concept identifying the situation where you've got missing values in a vector and you want to fill them in using some criterion, either a criterion from within the vector or a criterion from within individuals, or maybe some external criterion or something else. We'll look more at imputation in just a minute. I do see one question that I think pertains to the last example. And the question is, do you need double square brackets or just a single square bracket like in the book? Yes, actually in this case, returning to the previous example, either works in this situation. So we could just rerun this whole code and you'll see that we get the same result. When you're only selecting a single element, you largely get the same result as subsetting to that element. If you were going to select a range of elements, it gets a little bit more complicated and you would have to use the single square bracket. So in the book I think I have a single square bracket, and that's fine. Works in more cases. Maybe you just want to leave it as that. Good question. Thanks for asking that. We'll return now to stratified imputation. So we're trying to fill in some missing values here. And in this case, we're trying to fill in missing values a little bit at a time, which is what makes it stratified. Let me source that section of code, and let's take a look at the toy data frame that results. Here we have a PK data set with subjects A, B, and C, and we have times 1, 2, 3 for each of them. And we have weights for, actually looks like time varying weight for all the subjects, but occasionally that weight is missing. And oftentimes it's an error to have say a covariate be missing. So we'll want to clean that up a bit by doing some imputation. Now, as we pointed out in chapter 6, it would be an error to do last observation carried forward on weights directly, because you see here that if you carried 69 forward into this NA spot here, then B, subject B, would actually be inheriting a weight from some subject A. So what we want to do is stratify the imputation. We'll stratify by subject. And the easiest way I know to do that is on screen already. It's actually a metromrg function. We'll source that package, actually load that package right now. And we're working with 5.1 here. And we're going to create a new column, uppercase weight, that we'll put on here so we can compare it to the original weights. And here we're going to reapply the function LOCF across each individual subject. Across the weights for each individual subject. To provide some context, let's quickly look again at the help for reapply and see what it is we're providing to that function. You see that reapply has an X, that's the thing that you're operating on. In this case, we're operating on weight. It also requires an index that tells us how to break up weight into separate strata, if you will. And then you need to specify the function you wish to apply to each level of the data. So let's go ahead and run this line of code. It's actually fairly intuitive and straightforward once you get used to it. And we can look again at our data frame and see what the result was. Give ourselves some more space here. You see now we have weight imputed by LOCF. You see for subject C, the 72 weight in row 8 actually got carried forward into row 9. That's good. But for subject B, we still have an NA in that position because the imputation was stratified. That is a correct result. It's not a complete result because we still need to think of something to do for subject B, like maybe next observation carry backward, for instance. But whatever we choose, the point is that we're only working with the data from within B when we do that first imputation. And that was what we intended. Okay, so in summary, reapply is a great way to do stratified imputation. There may be others, but this one's fairly simple and works in a wide variety of circumstances. We've seen irregular extractions and stratified imputations. If you don't have any questions about that, let's move right on to dynamic transformations. And watch for questions while I'm setting up the problem. I'm going to set my seed to 0 here. That just ensures that I'll get the same result as when I ran this code for the book chapter. And then I'm going to create 3 data frames that are also created in the book chapter just to make sure I have them around. Actually, I'm not even sure we're going to use the demographic data in this session, but it's there in case we want to do something with it. Let's look at the dose data. Here we have a dosing data frame with subjects A, B, and C again, times 0, 1, 2, 3 with some missingness, it looks like. And these people are getting 40, 60, or 80 milligrams of something. Just what it is, we don't need to know or worry about right now. Let's take a look at their sample data. And this really says PK, which suggests pharmacokinetics. But we see here concentration data and pain scores, which is another type of response data. Pharmacodynamics, really. And what we've got is no missings for concentration, some missings for pain. There's a lot we could do with this. One thing we might want to do is to merge it into an analysis-ready data set. Now, in a tool like NonMem, you would probably want to specify a compartment for the doses and a compartment for the PK. For example, compartment 1 perhaps for doses and compartment 2 for PK, being the central compartment. That's often an often encountered scenario. Now here's my issue with that. The choice of compartment is really not a characteristic of the data per se. It's actually a characteristic or an attribute of how you choose to use the data. Now at this point in your data assembly process, you may be writing a script in which you're going to create 2, 3, or more data products from the same source data. So if you start adding attributes directly on the data frames themselves, you may have to go back and undo those decisions if you choose to use the data in another way. That can get very messy. So what I'm suggesting here is that we let our choices about how to use the data be implemented on the fly, or if you will, be implemented dynamically. And you can do that several ways. One easy way that you have at your disposal in BaseR is by use of the transform function. So for example, suppose you weren't going to put all the dose in compartment 1. Suppose you were going to create a non-mem model in which you put half the dose in compartment 1 and half the dose in compartment 2. And perhaps you want to make 2 analysis data sets and make another one where all the dose went into compartment 1. So here's a good opportunity where you just want compartment 1 to be something that gets instantiated on the fly and not hard-coded in the data itself. A subtle point, but it's worth considering if you do some complicated assemblies. So we're going to do that with the transform function today. And transform takes a data frame, for instance, and then it also returns a data frame after creating additional variables that you specify. One convenience of the transform function is that the other elements of your data frame are available to use in your calculations. So let's just look again what dose looks like. And then we're going to run just this snippet from our code here and see what that looks like. You see what we've done is we've dynamically created a compartment variable, compartment 1. And you can see that our doses now have all been dynamically adjusted to half their original values. And we could go ahead and merge that immediately with the variant where we also take half each dose, but assign that other half to compartment 2. And you see that result. You might also just run this piece of code and see that we could merge those together dynamically. Now you've got your compartment 1 and compartment 2 dosing side by side without ever having had to specify anything about compartments on the original data frame. It's still free and clear to use in other ways if you so choose. Now to complete this particular example, we would want to do a double merge here where we merge on the PK data as well. And there you see a nearly complete data frame with times and amounts and concentration measurements and compartments specified. Looks like we didn't specify a compartment for PK. Had this been an actual analysis case, we would need to go back and specify something, maybe compartment 3, and just make sure whoever's doing the modeling knows what compartments were chosen here. Any questions about that? Because this dynamic transformation is so useful, I think it's good to do one more example of it at least. Let's try another case where we have, again, dose and PK. Now, if your tool happens to be non-mem, you'll almost always want an EVID column associated with these. And again, EVID is just how we choose to use the data if we're preparing it for non-mem analysis. So we're going to let EVID be created dynamically. We're going to transform the dose and PK by supplying that value during the call to merge. So let's just go ahead and run this little piece of code. It's a standard merge. We're saying all is true, so we get all the records from both data sets, and we have EVID specified as 1 for doses and 0 for PK. The names are lowercase, which is unconventional, but the values are what you'd get for a classic non-mem data set. Running that section and then looking at the result. Now you see we have the EVID column with the zeros and ones, and they look like they're sorted. I can't tell exactly. Again, in an actual assembly situation, I would come back in here and apply a sort function to make sure I get these records in the order that I want them. Any questions about dynamic transformation? Let's take a look then at complex criteria. So we looked before at situations where you need to create some flag, say, in a data set. Like, well, there's one on screen here, and we'll use this as a motivating example. We have this data frame here. Suppose you wanted to ignore the records where pain is NA. You could say data ignore. We'll do a lot of ignoring today, so it's a good way to start. Set to data, let's say, is NA data pain. There, we got a flag showing us exactly where pain is NA, and you might, if it were a non-mem data set, you might use that as a comment column and put it at the front with the big letter C as the header. The point is that this assignment is very simple. It depends just on information. You're calculating one value for each row, but the result depends just on information within that row. In this case, a single piece of information. You could do something slightly more complex where you look at 2, 3, or 4 pieces of information, like ignore pain scores that occur on dosing records. They wouldn't really, the way we've assembled this, but you could look across the row and pick out various columns and combine the results to create a certain kind of flag. That grows in complexity. It becomes even more complexity when you're not only looking across the rows, but you're looking up and down columns as well. So, for example, I have a motivating challenge up here that says, let's take that data and let's ignore all non-zero concentrations that occur before the first dose. Well, let's get rid of our ignore flag for a second. And just look at the data again. It's pretty easy to find non-zero concentrations. You'd want to make sure that you test for NA first so that you don't get wild and unexpected results in the outcome. That's a horizontal criterion. I call it horizontal because it occurs within a row. Once for each row, you make that evaluation. But if you say occurs before the first dose, now you're looking vertically within, at least within an individual here. In fact, it's good to point out that we're looking within an individual because not only do we have horizontal criteria and not only do we have vertical criteria, we also need this calculation to be stratified. That is, each set of evaluations needs to be contained within a subject, so we're not inheriting information from one subject into another. So now we have a very complex criterion. You could snip apart the data set into separate subjects and solve each one separately. That would be ugly. It's a lot cleaner if you can leave the table flat the way it is and find some code that does what you want in a vectorized fashion. What we're going to do is break the problem into parts. Now, in the book, I give a more detailed breakdown than I'm going to give now. I'm just going to cut to the chase here and say, first, we're going to take our vertical criterion and transform it into a horizontal criterion. And once all our criteria are horizontal, then we can pretty much finish the calculation in one pass. You'll see what I mean. So let's take, for example, this piece of code here. We're going to create a column called before first dose. And what we're going to do is open up the data frame data. We use the with function to set all its columns before us in an empty data frame. So now we can use any column we choose simply by stating its name, like EVID. Now we're going to use the function before. This function occurs in the MetroMRG package. There are other ways to solve this problem, but this one is particularly handy. We're going to say before EVID equals 1. And, oh, by the way, we're going to say, let's do this calculation within subject. So the before function knows how to handle that. It's going to deal with one subject at a time, say subject A, and it's going to look at EVID. It's going to find where EVID is 1. And unless you say otherwise, it's going to take the first instance where EVID is 1. At this point, every record that physically occurs before this record is going to be considered true, and this record and all others thereafter within the individual will be false. Basically, you're getting exactly what you would expect, or at least exactly what was being requested by whoever wrote this criterion. So let's go ahead and run that line of code and see exactly what happens here. We'll source that. And then take a look at our data. You see we have now a vector of trues and falses. And in each case we're saying, is this particular record before the first dose, at least within subject? In the case of record 1, yes it is. Record 2 actually is the dose, and so no, that is not before the first dose. So down here in subject B, we actually have 2 records that occur before the first dose. And of course, testing for first dose is done just by using the EVID value, as is traditional for non-mem. You could easily substitute other criteria if you had them. Now you see, we no longer have any vertical criteria to worry about, because before first dose, which was implicitly vertical, is now explicitly horizontal. You have an answer for every row. Now you can look simultaneously at the conc scores and at the position values and do a direct comparison without any nesting at all. We'll do that right here. We are now ready to create our ignore flag. We can do that all in one pass without worrying about subjects because it's completely horizontal, does not need to be stratified. We're just going to say with the data frame data, let's create a flag that tests whether EVID is 0. That is, we're testing for sample records. And we're also going to test that concentration is greater than 0. We're not really worried about the 0 concentrations. That's what you'd expect for a sample that was taken before any dose was given. Now, we happen to know that there are some NA concentrations, and if that's the case, you should always protect your evaluation of inequalities by testing first for NA, because we're only going to worry about the records where concentration, we're only going to evaluate concentration greater than 0 for those records that are not NA. Ugly things can happen if you throw NAs into an inequality or an expression of equality. So we protect this evaluation with the isNA evaluation. And lastly, we load on our criterion before first dose. We can go ahead and ignore that set of criteria simultaneously. I'll highlight it and run it. And we can look at the data one more time. Now, in this particular case, it just so happens that our ignore flag turns out to be identical to our before first dose flag. It just happens that all the concentrations before the first dose were specified, that is not NA, and they were also greater than 0. If there had been some zeros in there or some NAs in there before the first dose, you get a slightly different result. But that is one example of how to solve complex criteria during a data assembly. Clearly an advanced topic, and one you will probably encounter at some point. So it's good to have strategies in mind for dealing with it. In the homework, actually, there is an assignment or a question that uses the parallel function to before. It's a function called after. So you might want to go into the help from MetroMRG and look at before and after and see exactly how those are used. Take particular note of the argument called n, which helps you control whether you're counting instances from the beginning or the end of a vector or subvector. Let's move on now and talk a little bit about table reorganization. This might be a good time to slow down because it's one of the most complex topics with which we deal. And even people that use the tools I'm about to describe with great frequency need to stop and think carefully about what they're doing at this point. Sometimes you get data in this fashion. I'll give you an example data set that we can work on that has observations side by side. For example, here we have a little bit of blood pressure data, and we have systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure side by side. There may be situations where, even though all the information you need is present, you want it in a different table arrangement. For example, you might want to stack those two columns and just repeat the values in other columns for each entry that occurs. Or on the other hand, you might receive data in a stacked form and actually want it like this, with data side by side, in which case you'd be unstacking data. I think R actually has some functions called stack and unstack. You can look at the help for those. That would get you close to manipulating this table for purposes of reorganization. I'm going to show you some techniques that come from the package Reshape. Now, if you've already loaded the MetromRG package, then you've also loaded the Reshape package because of a dependency. So we don't need to do any loading right now, but we do need to know something about the function melt. So let me cut right to the chase and say what melt does is it takes all the things that are supposed to be observations and it stacks them. It stacks them systematically so that they all end up in a single column. And that we refer to as a molten data frame. From that position, you can recreate this original table design and almost any other table design possible given these sets of attributes. Now, in the book chapter, I spend a little bit of time talking about table design theory, and I suggest that one way of thinking about a table is that it's just a collection of observations and their attributes. So let's break that down a little bit and work with that definition. For example, in the table ahead of us or in front of us, the value 120 is an observation of blood pressure. And you could think of the subject designator as an attribute of that observation. It's a classifier, really. And so really is the position value. This subject was sitting when that blood pressure was taken. That's an attribute of this particular observation. Now, diastolic blood pressure, 80, that's really not an attribute of this particular observation. But hey, here we've got two column headers that really are attributes. For example, systolic is an attribute of 120, and diastolic was an attribute of 80. So from that, let's step back for a second and make the generalization that for any given table, the attributes of the observations might be occurring in columns, such as AB occurs over here and sit stand occurs over here, or the attributes of observations might be included as column headers. Not to make this too complicated, I'll just introduce the language of the headers being column level distinctions and these other guys being row level distinctions. So right now we have subject and position as row level distinctions because the values of interest are in the row itself. And systolic, diastolic, that's a column level distinction because we have separate columns that distinguish those types of values from each other. So the magic here is really just to interconvert row level and column level distinctions. And it starts to be very visually explicit when you use the tools of the reshape package. So, for example, let's run this code here. What we're going to do is ask reshape to melt the data frame A, and we're going to say up front that our subject and position columns are ID variables, that is, they're identifying something about our observations, and that the observation variables or the measure variables are SBP and DBP. Any columns you don't mention here will be dropped by default. So we'll go ahead and run that piece of code, and let's look at the molten data frame. Beautiful. Now what we see is all the blood pressure is stacked in a single column, and we now have a variable which reshape makes for you automatically. A column called variable, which has, it's really a flag telling the columns that those values came from. This particular form of the data is really easy to plot using XY plot because you have a lot of options before you. All these values are going to be y-axis values in most cases. And then you can use what you need to for x-axis values, or you can also use these other columns not only for your x-axis but also for grouping arguments, or possibly subsetting arguments, or conditioning variables, or things like that. Gives you a lot of options. Sometimes, however, if maybe you're not doing plotting or maybe you need some other form, we move on and actually cast this data frame into other shapes. And the cast function requires a molten data frame, one of which we have available to us now, and it also requires a formula. The formula is always in the form x plus y plus z tilde x plus y plus z, or whatever else you might have. In this case, we're going to cast using the formula subject plus variable tilde position. And what we're seeing is that everything to the left of the tilde is going to be a row level distinction, and everything to the right of the tilde we would like to preserve as a column level distinction. So, for example, if you run this line of code, and I haven't assigned it to any variable name, I'm just running it dynamically or anonymously, you get this result. And you see that as we requested, subject and variable still are row level distinctions because you look inside the rows to get that information, whereas position now, sitting or standing, is a column level distinction. We have separate columns for sit and stand. It's the exact same information we had before, but now the roles of position and the variable have been reversed. To prove that point, we can get back our original table by running this line of code. We're saying, hey, subject and position are going to be row level distinctions, and we'll let variable be the column level distinction. Well, variable was created from columns, so that should give us back our original data frame. And it does. This result is identical to what we started with before we did any melting at all. So you see that you can use melt and cast in combination to powerful effect, either giving you exclusively stacked data, completely stacked data, or going a step further than that and rearranging your data back into some other combination of row level and column level distinctions. It takes a bit of thinking, a bit of practice to get those formulas right. One rule of thumb is worth noting that you almost never use the word value in your cast formula, because value is, of course, the thing you're casting, and R knows that instinctively. It's a column that gets created for you when you do the melting, and it's a column that is consumed when you do the casting. So you don't really have to mention it on either end. You always get this variable column, and I know there are options to rename this to some other column as you do the melting. You can certainly rename it to something else after the fact as well. Any questions about table reorganization? If not, let me call your attention to the exercises at the end of the chapter. I'll just briefly review what's going on here for you so that you're familiar with it when you get to it later this week. The first one asked you to use information from listing 11.1. That was the first little example we did way up here. Let me see it. That was just that little string, that character vector of ID values. I think you'll have no trouble with that whatsoever. The second question draws on the example code that occurs immediately after the exercises. Example code is a section 11.8, and you see that I've used that code in class as well. Has example code for a dose, a PK, and a demography data frame. I don't think you actually use the demography data frame in this exercise, but it's handy to have available for a complete example. The third question, question number 2, you're actually doing some imputation with LOCF. Should be straightforward. In exercise number 3, you're merging dose and PK, somewhat similar to what we did in class, except this time you're creating a type variable dynamically. In question number 4, again you're using dose and PK as below, and you're creating an ignore flag. We did something like that in class, but here the condition is slightly different to force you to think about what's going on and look at additional columns before calculating your result. And in question number 5, again you're creating an ignore flag, same data, but now you're looking for doses that occur after the last sample rather than samples that occur before the first dose. So essentially you're standing the question on its head. In number 6, we're doing some table transformations that will make good use of melt and cast from the reshape package. And you're interconverting column level and row level distinctions in a slightly different way. In number 7, this is a combination problem where first you do some table reorganization to get concentration and pain into a single column. You're sorting the result and then creating an ignore flag, somewhat analogous to what we did before, but now you have different sets of records that you may need to handle in sensitive ways. In number 8, you're actually dropping pain scores and looking just at concentration values and rearranging the data by time columns instead of the form that it was originally provided. I think that's pretty straightforward, but I'll leave it to you to ask me additional questions about that if you have them. I'm going to call the lecture at this point. We'll stop here. I will stay online until the top of the hour. Feel free to stick around and talk to me about anything we've discussed today or about some topic left over from a previous lecture. I'll be happy to take your questions and stay here as long as you do. Okay, someone's saying that none of the R mirror sites seem to have the MetrumRG package. Well, I don't know how the mirrors work. I just go to crayon.rproject.org. If I type packages and look at the available packages sorted by name, usually I just go find in page MetrumRG and there it is. So that's disturbing if the mirrors aren't carrying it, but it's definitely there and you can find it by searching that page. I see a second question. What is the best way to install the package? The best way, I'll show you the best way. What you would do is you get a terminal session up like this and you say R, assume you have R already installed, and let me hide my browser, and at the R prompt you say install packages and you say MetrumRG, and if that can't be done, the function should tell you why. You should get errors back saying sorry, you have to have the XML package or the fork package or something like that. but that almost always works. It works very well for me. And that way you don't have to download anything. It just installs right over the internet. Another question, will you post today's R script? Yes, I will. In fact, I will do that right now. I just need to save it first. I see another question. Will we have an extra week to cover Chapter 8, Modeling Outside of R? That's a good question. Let's see what our course outline says. Modeling outside of R. Yes, currently that's scheduled for December 6th, or the week of December 6th. We're going to, we'll make sure that anything you need to know for the exam has already been covered before the exam is due. Looks like final exam is due on 12/15. I think the last lecture has material that's not even covered by the exam, so there's no issue there. Final project due 12/16. Those are fairly close together, so you probably don't want to leave them all for the last minute. Okay, the script for today's lecture has been posted to the course webpage. Thank you all. We'll see you Friday, same time, 1 o'clock, and we'll go over the exercises for Chapter 11 at that time.